Hello everyone. This is going to be a little video on doing a flat felled seam. The flat felled seams are enclosed seams, which on a lot of your classic tailored shirts, they use this seam. If you also look at your blue jeans, probably your blue jeans have a flat felled seam as well on them. To begin the seam, you have a choice whether you want to do it with all of the felting or felling, the flat felling on the outside of the garment, or if you want it all inside. My demo here is going to be with it all inside. So we start with our right sides together of the seam that we're going to sew, and you would want to make sure you know what your seam allowance is. We're going to use a 5/8, which is our traditional seam allowance in the majority of the home sewing patterns. And we're just going to pin it together and take that to the machine to stitch. Now remember to understand where your guide is, so that if your needle position is in center, where is my guide? And again, here is 5/8. Needle is in the center. There's my 5/8 mark. The camera just in a little more. You can see that. Okay, 5/8. I start about 1/4 of an inch in from the edge. I bury my needle. I hold both my bottom and my top threads for the first couple of stitches forward, and then back stitch to the edge, and then forward. Holding those threads, remember to always do that, because that will prevent any kind of bird nesting, that beautiful bobbin art and messy knotting that you get. Sorry, I just bumped the camera. Approaching the end, so I'm going to back stitch a couple, about 1/4 inch away, and then on off. Trim my threads. Now we're going to move over to pressing it. Now I'm over at the ironing table, and I am ready to press it. The first step in pressing is to actually press it all to one direction, meaning both seam allowances to one direction. And the rule of thumb is usually that you press it away from the front. So if it's a side seam, you'd press it towards the back. If it's a princess seam, you'd press it away from the center front and towards the back. So there, I've pressed it all to one side. I'm going to turn it over and make sure that I've got that seam really pressed out neatly. Okay, nice and neatly pressed. The next step is to come in here, and the under seam allowance right here, this one, we're going to trim that down to 1/8 of an inch. So that under one that we pressed on top of, we're going to trim that down. Careful not to cut your garment. Or the other seam allowance. Okay, make sure that I've got him nice and narrow. that 1/8 of an inch. Okay, now we're going to take this side of the seam allowance and we're going to fold it over that one, taking the raw edge right to my stitch line. Now it's important that we do this evenly, so hopefully you've sewn your seam evenly and you did a good job at cutting it out. We want this distance to be the same in the fold over. Otherwise, our little fell or our little flat fell area will vary. It won't be even all the way up and down the seam. So there, I've pressed that like that. I'm going to open this back up and see I've covered this raw edge, and now we're going to press it back the way it was, away from the center front towards the back of the garment, making sure that we keep this little fold distance right in here even all the way down. So if I've started, it's about a little more than 1/4 inch is what it should figure out to be, but not a full 3/8. You want to keep that nice and even all the way down. We now take it back to the machine to stitch in. Okay, we're back at the machine now to stitch down our beautifully pressed flat fell seam. And now I'm going to stitch it, and the key here is I'm stitching here on this back side, but there's going to be, in the end, stitching show here on the outside. So I want that to be even from this seam over to where I'm stitching. That means I want to have a good gauge on this side to gauge by. So I'm going to place my needle here, and I may increase my stitch length just a little bit because this is kind of like a top stitch, edge stitch that we're doing. And I'm going to find where it's pretty close to this edge but not right on it, and see where my thread is over on the other for a guide. So like that. So now my guide is going to be this, my thread line right there on this edge of my foot. Let me see if I can zoom in on that just a little bit. There we go. So this thread I am going to match up right with the edge, not on the outside of my foot, but right where this metal starts from the plastic, right in there. It's a little bit of plastic coming up over that. And so I've got a gauge. You may not be able to see that, but I see. So I'm going to be able to move this thread line right there. So I've chosen where my guide is. Now I'm going to hold my threads again as I start to prevent any kind of bobbin bird nesting. Couple stitch forward, 1 or 2 back, and now I'm ready to go. And of course you want to take this a little slower because I'm really watching that guide right there as it goes into the machine. I'm not really watching the needle. I'm making sure that I'm guiding that stitch line right along that edge of my foot where I want it, so that my distance apart on my stitching is going to be nice and even. Okay, so I'm almost at the end here. I'm going to back stitch and off. Trim my threads. And there we have a nice and evenly stitched. Let me zoom back out again a little bit. A nice evenly stitched here that I've got this distance between here and here even all the way, which will make it on this side an even amount from that seam line right there, so that it looks nice and even all the way down. Now you may want to come back and put another row right on this edge. You can do that. I would do that from the front. Now if I was going to add another stitch line, There's lots of creative things you could do there if you wanted to have a decorative stitch as well.